On the night of September 23rd, 1241, an old man descended into darkness. The cellar beneath the farmhouse at Reykholt was cold. It was always cold, even in summer when the Icelandic sun barely set and the land softened into something almost hospitable. The underground chambers held the chill of deep earth, of stone that had never known warmth. Now, in late September, with autumn hardening into the first promise of winter, the cellar was a place of absolute cold, the kind that settles into the joints, the kind that makes an aging body remember every fall from a horse, every night spent sleeping on frozen ground, every decade that has passed since youth. He was 62 years old. His name was Snorri Sturluson. Above him, in the farmhouse he had built into one of the finest estates in Iceland, he could hear them moving. Footsteps on wooden floors, the clatter of men who had come armed and were not trying to be quiet about it. 70 of them, perhaps more. They had arrived after dark, crossing the fields from the direction of Reykholt's eastern boundaries, and by the time the alarm was raised, they were already inside the compound. His servants had scattered. His few remaining allies had fled or been cut down. There was nowhere left to go but down. The cellar had a single entrance, a wooden door, a short flight of steps, and then the storage chambers where Reykholt kept its provisions through the long Icelandic winter. Barrels of skyr, dried fish, smoked meat, the accumulated wealth of a man who had spent 4 decades acquiring, scheming, marrying, divorcing, writing, and above all, surviving in a society where survival was never guaranteed. He waited. The footsteps grew louder. Torchlight flickered at the top of the stairs, and then a voice he knew, a voice that belonged to a man who had once been his son-in-law, a man named Gizur Thorvaldsson, called down into the darkness. The words that followed would survive for 8 centuries. They would be recorded in the sagas that Snorri himself had helped establish as a literary form. They would be debated by scholars, parsed for meaning, analyzed for what they revealed about the moment and the men who spoke them. Egi skal hugva. Do not strike. The words could have been a plea. They could have been a command. They could have been the last negotiating gambit of a man who had spent his entire life talking his way out of consequences. Snorri Sturluson had never been a warrior. He had never swung a sword in battle, never led men into combat, never proven himself in the violent calculus that determined status among the Icelandic chieftains of his era. His weapons had always been words, treaties, marriages, poems composed for kings, histories written for posterity, the careful cultivation of alliances that could be activated when needed and discarded when they became inconvenient. Now, in a cellar beneath his own house, with armed men on the stairs and no allies left to call upon, he reached for words one final time. Egi skal hugva. They struck anyway. The men who killed Snorri Sturluson that night were acting on orders from the king of Norway. Håkon Håkonarsson, the fourth of his name, had grown tired of Snorri's promises and delays, his failure to deliver Iceland into Norwegian sovereignty as he had sworn to do, his habit of accepting royal gifts and royal hospitality, and then returning home to pursue his own interests rather than the interests of the crown. The king had sent word to Gizur and to another chieftain named Kolbein Ungi. Snorri was to be brought to Norway, or he was to be killed. The order was clear. The consequences of disobedience were equally clear. Gizur chose to interpret the order in the manner that best served his own ambitions. He did not attempt to bring Snorri to Norway. He brought 70 armed men to Reykholt in the middle of the night, cornered an unarmed old man in a cellar, and had him cut down where he stood. The body was left where it fell. It would be retrieved later, cleaned, prepared for burial according to the customs of a Christian Iceland that had been Christian for barely 2 centuries. The funeral would be attended by men who had plotted his death and men who had loved him. The estate at Reykholt would pass to others. The feuds that had consumed the final decades of his life would continue for another generation until there was almost no one left to feud. But something else would survive. In the decades before his death, in the brief intervals between political crises and assassination attempts and marriages of convenience, Snorri Sturluson had been writing. He had compiled a handbook for poets that preserved the myths and legends of the pre-Christian Norse world in a form that would otherwise have been lost forever. He had written a history of the Norwegian kings that stretched back into the legendary past and forward to his own era. He had created, almost accidentally, the foundation upon which nearly everything we know about the Viking Age would come to rest. The man who died in that cellar was a schemer, a political failure, and by many accounts, a coward. He was also the reason we know the names of Odin and Thor, the reason we know what Valhalla was supposed to look like, the reason we know the shape of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle at the end of the world. Without Snorri Sturluson, the mythology of the Norse would be a collection of fragments, references in other texts, archaeological guesses. With him, it is a literature. This is the story of how one man's ambition preserved a world, and how the world he lived in destroyed him for it. The sources for Snorri Sturluson's life are, by medieval standards, remarkably abundant. We have the Icelandic saga, the saga of the Icelanders, written by Snorri's nephew Sturla Thordarson, within a few decades of Snorri's death. Sturla was present for many of the events he describes. He was also a participant in the feuds that killed his uncle, which makes his account simultaneously invaluable and suspect. He had reasons to shape the narrative. He had debts to pay and scores to settle, and a version of history to establish that would serve his own interests. Every word he wrote must be read with that in mind. We have the Hakonar saga Hakonarsonar, the saga of the Norwegian king who ordered Snorri's death, also written by Sturla Thordarson under commission from the Norwegian crown. Here the bias runs in a different direction. Sturla was writing for the man who had killed his uncle, explaining and justifying the killing for posterity. The saga presents Snorri as a man who broke his oaths and betrayed his king. It does not dwell on the question of whether the king's orders were just. We have Snorri's own writings, the Prose Edda, the Heimskringla, and possibly portions of Egil's saga, which tell us nothing directly about his life, but everything about his mind. The way he thought about history, the way he understood poetry, the choices he made about what to preserve and what to discard. And we have the broader saga literature of medieval Iceland, the family sagas and contemporary sagas and legendary sagas, which provide context for the world Snorri inhabited even when they do not mention him by name. What we do not have is anything like objectivity. Every source was written by someone with interests. Every source was shaped by the politics of its moment. The Snorri who emerges from these texts is a composite figure, assembled from fragments that do not always agree with each other. We know when he was born. We know when he died. We know the names of his wives and children and enemies. But the inner life, the private calculations, the unspoken fears, the moments of doubt or triumph that never made it into the record, remains inaccessible. We are left with inference, with probability, with the careful reconstruction of a life from the traces it left behind. This is, as it happens, exactly the kind of work Snorri himself spent his career doing. He would have understood the problem. Iceland in 1179, the year of Snorri's birth, was unlike anywhere else in the medieval world. It was a society without a king. It had been founded 2 centuries earlier by Norwegian settlers fleeing the consolidation of royal power under Harald Fairhair, and it had deliberately constructed itself as an alternative to monarchy. There was no central government, no standing army, no taxes, no police. Instead, there were chieftains, godar, the plural of godiai, a word that originally meant something like priest, but had evolved to mean something more like patron. These chieftains did not rule territories, they ruled relationships. A chieftain's power derived from the number of farmers who had chosen to attach themselves to him, to accept his protection and his arbitration of disputes in exchange for their support. The system was elegant in theory. In practice, it was a machine for producing conflict. Because chieftaincies could be bought, sold, inherited, and accumulated, power tended to concentrate. By the 12th century, the 60-odd chieftaincies that had existed at the settlement of Iceland had collapsed into the hands of a few dozen families, and those families had collapsed into a handful of major clans, the Sturlungs, the Haukdalir, the Asbjörnings, the Svinfellings. These were the great houses of Iceland, and they were locked in a competition that had no mechanism for resolution. The Althing, the annual assembly where all free Icelanders theoretically gathered to make law and settle disputes, had been designed for a society of rough equals. It had no enforcement mechanism. Its judgments depended on the willingness of the losing party to accept them, or the ability of the winning party to compel acceptance through force. As power concentrated, the Althing became less a legislature than a theater, a place where the great chieftains performed their disputes in public before resolving them through violence in private. This was the world into which Snorri Sturluson was born, a world where poetry and law and violence were inextricably linked, where a man's survival depended on his ability to navigate webs of alliance and enmity that shifted constantly, where the most dangerous thing you could be was successful, because success attracted the attention of men who wanted what you had. Snorri's father was a chieftain named Sturla Thordarson, not to be confused with the nephew who would later write his biography. Sturla the Elder was a powerful man, aggressive and litigious, the kind of chieftain who expanded his influence through a combination of strategic marriages and strategic violence. He had married well. His wife, Gudni Bödvarsdóttir, came from one of the wealthiest families in Iceland, with connections that stretched across the island's political landscape. But Snorri was not his father's heir. He was the third son. In a society that practiced a form of partible inheritance, where estates were divided among all surviving children rather than passing intact to the eldest, being a third son meant receiving a portion that might not be enough to maintain the family's status. Snorri would have to make his own way or find a patron who could provide what his birth could not. He found one before he was 3 years old. The circumstances were unusual. Sturla the Elder had become embroiled in a legal dispute with a priest named Pál Sölvason. The details are obscure, something about an assault, a counter-assault, the usual spiral of claim and counterclaim that characterized Icelandic legal proceedings. The case went to the Althing. It was arbitrated by the most powerful chieftain in Iceland, a man named Jon Lofsson of Oddi. Jon Lofsson was not merely powerful. He was prestigious in a way that transcended ordinary political calculation. His grandmother had been a princess, the illegitimate daughter of King Magnus the Thirst of Norway. His family, the Odfrjar, had been chieftains and scholars for generations. Oddi itself, the family estate in southern Iceland, was the closest thing the island had to a center of learning. It was where young men went to be educated, where manuscripts were copied, where the traditions of Latin Christianity and vernacular Icelandic literature met and merged. The settlement that Jon Lofsson crafted for the dispute between Sturla and Pál included an unusual provision. As part of the compensation, Jon agreed to foster Sturla's youngest son. The boy would be raised at Oddi, educated at Jon's expense, and integrated into the most prestigious household in Iceland. The boy was Snorri. He was 2 years old. Fostering was a common practice in medieval Iceland, but it was usually done between families of roughly equal status. For Jon Lofsson to foster a child of the Sturlungs was a sign of extraordinary favor, or perhaps of extraordinary calculation. Jon may have seen something in the boy. He may have wanted a connection to the rising Sturlung clan. He may simply have needed a way to resolve a troublesome dispute without further violence. Whatever his motives, the decision shaped everything that followed. Snorri spent his formative years at Oddi, removed from his birth family, immersed in an environment of wealth and learning that would have been impossible anywhere else in Iceland. He learned to read. He learned Latin, at least enough to access the historical and theological texts that formed the foundation of medieval education. He learned law, the intricate procedural code that governed Icelandic society. He learned poetry, the complex metrical forms that were the supreme artistic achievement of Old Norse culture. And he learned history, the genealogies, the king lists, the legendary narratives that connected the present to the past. He also learned something else, something that would prove more important than any of his formal education. He learned how power worked. Jon Lofsson was the most successful political operator of his generation. He had maintained his position through decades of shifting alliances, navigating the feuds and counter-feuds that destroyed lesser chieftains, accumulating influence without ever becoming so powerful that others felt compelled to unite against him. He did this through a combination of strategic marriage, strategic generosity, and strategic restraint. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He knew when to press an advantage and when to accept a compromise. He knew how to make other men feel that supporting him was in their interest. Snorri watched, Snorri learned. But there was a gap between what Jan Lofsson understood intuitively and what Snorri would spend his life trying to replicate. Jon had been born to power, his legitimacy was assumed, his authority was inherited. He could afford to be generous because no one doubted his right to be where he was. Snorri would never have that security. He was a fostered third son, raised above his station, always aware that his position depended on performance rather than birthright. He would have to earn what Jon had been given, and the strategies that worked for a man born to the apex of Icelandic society might not work for a man climbing toward it from below. Jan Lofsson died in 1197 when Snorri was 18 years old. The death was a crisis. Jan had been Snorri's patron, his protector, the source of his social position. Without Jon, Snorri was a young man with an excellent education, impressive connections, and no resources of his own. The Adi estate passed to Jon's legitimate heirs. Snorri was not among them. He needed to establish himself. He needed land. He needed wealth. He needed a chieftaincy of his own. The tool he used was marriage. Snorri married Herdis Bersadottir, the daughter of a wealthy priest named Bersi Vermundarson. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Bersi got a well-connected son-in-law with ties to the Odverjar. Snorri got access to Bersi's wealth and, more importantly, to the estate that Bersi controlled, Reykholt. Reykholt was not, at the time of Snorri's marriage, one of the great estates of Iceland. It was prosperous but provincial, located in the western valleys, far from the centers of power in the south. But it had potential, it had good farmland, it had access to resources, and it had hot springs, geothermally heated water that bubbled up from the volcanic earth, warm even in the depths of winter. Snorri recognized what Reykholt could become. Over the following decades, he would transform it into one of the finest estates in Iceland, complete with a heated bathing pool that became famous across the island. The pool still exists, 8 centuries later. Visitors can still see the stone-lined basin where Snorri would have soaked in the warm water, composing poetry in his head, calculating his next political move. But that was later. In 1199, when Snorri took up residence at Reykholt, he was still a young man without a chieftaincy, without independent power, without the resources to play the game at the highest level. He needed more, and he would prove willing to do almost anything to get it. The next 2 decades of Snorri's life were a masterclass in acquisition. He accumulated chieftaincies. In the Icelandic system, a chieftaincy was a form of property that could be bought, inherited, or seized. Snorri did all 3. He purchased shares in chieftaincies from men who needed cash. He inherited portions through his wife's family connections. He maneuvered himself into positions where chieftaincies became available, and he was the obvious candidate to claim them. By 1206, just 7 years after his marriage, he controlled enough chieftaincies to be considered one of the major players in Icelandic politics. By 1215, he was elected lawspeaker of the Althing, the closest thing Iceland had to a national office. The lawspeaker's job was to recite the law from memory at each annual assembly, to provide authoritative interpretation when disputes arose, to serve as the living repository of Iceland's legal tradition. It was a position of enormous prestige, but limited formal power. It was also the perfect platform for a man who wanted to be at the center of every important negotiation without committing himself to any particular side. Snorri served as lawspeaker from 1215 to 1218. He would serve again from 1222 to 1231. No one in Icelandic history would hold the position longer. But chieftaincies and legal positions were only part of his strategy. He also accumulated marriages, his own and those of his children. His marriage to Herdis deteriorated within a few years. The sources do not explain why, but by the early 1200s they were living separately, Snorri at Reykholt and Herdis at her father's estate. They never formally divorced, but the marriage was over in practice. Snorri took up with a series of concubines who bore him children, expanding his network of potential alliances through the marriage market. His daughter, Halbera, married first Kolbein Tumason, a powerful chieftain who died in battle in 1208, and then Arni Oreda, another chieftain. His son Orakia married into the Haukdalir clan, connecting the Sturlungs to their main rivals. His daughter Ingibjorg married Gizur Thorvaldsson, the man who would eventually kill Snorri in the cellar at Reykholt. Each marriage was a calculation, each alliance was an investment. Snorri was building a web of connections that would, theoretically, make him untouchable, related by blood or marriage to so many powerful families that attacking him would mean attacking everyone. The strategy had a fatal flaw. It assumed that family loyalty would trump political ambition. It assumed that sons-in-law would value their connection to Snorri more than they valued the opportunities his death might create. It assumed, in other words, that other men would play by the rules Snorri understood. They would not. The wealth Snorri accumulated in these years was staggering by Icelandic standards. At his peak, he controlled estates across the island. He had interests in fishing, in trade, in the collection of rents and dues from the farmers who owed him allegiance. He had money enough to build and rebuild Reykholt, to expand the estate's buildings, to create the hot spring bathing pool that became his signature indulgence. He had money enough to travel to Norway twice, at a time when the voyage was expensive, dangerous, and undertaken only by men with serious business abroad. But the wealth also made him a target. In the Iceland of the early 13th century, there was no mechanism for a rich man to convert his wealth into security. There were no banks, no investments, no way to transform money into something that could not be taken by force. Wealth meant visible, tangible goods, land, livestock, buildings, household goods. Everything Snorri owned was known to his neighbors, evaluated by his rivals, coveted by men who had less. The only way to protect wealth was through power. And power, in Iceland, meant the ability to mobilize men for violence. This was Snorri's fundamental problem. He had the wealth of a great chieftain. He had the legal knowledge, the political connections, the marriage alliances. But he did not have the temperament for violence, and he did not have the reputation that came from success in armed conflict. He never led men into battle. He never killed an enemy with his own hands. He never demonstrated, in the way that mattered most to his contemporaries, that he was willing and able to defend what he had. The sources are consistent on this point. Snorri preferred negotiation to confrontation. When threatened, he withdrew. When challenged, he sought arbitration. When forced to choose between fighting and fleeing, he fled. His contemporaries noticed. The saga writers record their observations with something like wonder. Here was a man of enormous resources who would not use them in his own defense. Here was a chieftain who acted like a merchant, counting costs, calculating odds, always looking for the deal that would let everyone walk away. In a society that valued courage above almost everything else, Snorri was understood to be a coward. Whether this was a character flaw or a strategic choice, the sources do not say. Perhaps Snorri genuinely lacked physical courage. Perhaps he understood more clearly than his contemporaries that the game of violence had no winners in the long run, that every killing demanded a counter-killing, that every feud consumed the feuders, that the Icelandic Commonwealth was destroying itself one battle at a time. If so, he was right. Within 40 years of his death, the great families would have bled each other nearly to extinction, and Norway would absorb what remained. But being right did not make him safe. In the world Snorri inhabited, a rich man who would not fight was a rich man waiting to be robbed. The other thing Snorri accumulated in those years of rising power was poetry. He had learned the craft at Adi, under the tutelage of men who still remembered the traditions that stretched back to the age of the Skalds. But he had taken the tradition further than his teachers. He had begun to systematize it, to analyze its meters and its kennings, to understand not just how to compose poetry, but how poetry worked, the deep structures beneath the surface ornament. The result would eventually become the Prose Edda, the single most important document for understanding Old Norse poetry and mythology. But that was later, in the 1220s and 1230s, when Snorri was past his political peak and had time for sustained literary work. In the years of his rise, his poetry served a more immediate purpose. It was a tool of diplomacy, a gift that could be offered to kings. In 1218, Snorri made his first voyage to Norway. The journey was significant. Few Icelanders of Snorri's status made the crossing. The sea voyage was dangerous, several weeks in an open ship, exposed to storms, dependent on winds, with no guarantee of arrival. and Norway itself was complicated territory for an Icelandic chieftain. The Norwegian kings had never forgotten that Iceland had been settled by men fleeing Norwegian royal authority. They had never stopped hoping that Iceland might be brought back under the crown. Snorri went anyway. He went bearing poetry. The king of Norway in 1218 was young. Håkon Håkonarsson was only 14 years old, still ruling through regents and advisors. But the real power in Norway at that moment was not the king. It was the Jarl Skuli Bardarsson, the regent, the uncle of the king's rival claimant, a man playing a long game for influence over the young monarch. Snorri composed poetry for both of them. He praised the king in the elaborate, elusive style that the tradition demanded. He praised the Jarl with equal skill. He played both sides, establishing himself as a court poet of distinction, a man who could immortalize his patrons in verses that would be remembered for generations. And in return, he received gifts. He received titles. Jarl Skuli made him a skutilsvein, a court retainer, a position of nominal honor. He received promises of friendship and support. He received, though he may not have fully understood it at the time, a set of obligations that would eventually cost him his life. Jarl Skuli wanted Iceland, not to rule it himself necessarily, but to bring it under Norwegian influence, to add it to the resources he could deploy in his ongoing competition with the young king. He saw Snorri as a potential instrument, a powerful Icelander who could return home with Norwegian backing, who could consolidate power, who could pave the way for Norwegian sovereignty. Snorri accepted the assignment. He accepted it, the sources suggest, without intending to fulfill it. He wanted the gifts and the titles and the prestige of Norwegian royal favor. He did not want to actually deliver Iceland to a foreign king. This was, in retrospect, an error. Skuli would eventually fall from power, executed by King Håkon in 1240 after a failed rebellion. But before his fall, he had introduced Snorri into a network of Norwegian royal expectations that Snorri could not escape. When Håkon became king in his own right, he remembered the promises that had been made. He remembered the chieftain who had accepted gifts and sworn oaths and then returned to Iceland to pursue his own interests. He remembered, and he did not forget. Snorri returned to Iceland in 1220, laden with gifts, puffed with Norwegian honors, and almost immediately embroiled in the feuds that would consume his middle years. The Sturlung era, the decades of escalating violence that would ultimately destroy the Icelandic Commonwealth, was entering its acute phase. The great families were no longer competing for advantage. They were fighting for survival. Each chieftain's fall created opportunities for the survivors to absorb his power, which made everyone a target, which made alliances unstable, which made violence both more frequent and more consequential. Snorri tried to stay above it. He maneuvered. He negotiated. He used his connections, the marriage alliances, the Norwegian prestige, the legal expertise, to position himself as an arbiter rather than a combatant. It did not work. His nephew, Sturla Sigvatsson, was rising as a force in his own right. Sturla was everything Snorri was not: aggressive, violent, willing to pursue feuds to their bloody conclusions. He saw Snorri's wealth and influence as resources to be seized, not inherited. He saw the family name as something to be won through conquest, not preserved through diplomacy. The two men circled each other through the 1220s and 1230s. Sometimes they were allies, united against common enemies. Sometimes they were rivals, competing for the same chieftaincies and the same royal favor. Sturla made his own voyage to Norway. He made his own promises to the king. He returned to Iceland with his own commission to bring the island under Norwegian sovereignty. The difference was that Sturla intended to try. In 1236, the simmering tension between the Sturlungs and their rivals exploded into open warfare. The Battle of Örlygsstadir, fought on August 21st of that year, was the bloodiest single engagement in Icelandic history. Sturla Sigvatsson led his forces against a coalition of his enemies. He was killed, along with his father Sigvatar and dozens of their followers. The Sturlungs, so recently ascendant, were shattered. Snorri was not there. He had not joined Sturla's army. He had not committed himself to the battle that destroyed his family. Whether this was cowardice or wisdom, the sources cannot agree. Snorri's enemies saw it as proof of his fundamental unreliability. Even his own kin could not count on him when it mattered. His defenders, if he had any by this point, might have argued that Sturla's recklessness had been obvious, that anyone with sense could see the coalition against him was too strong, that staying home was the only rational choice. Either way, Snorri survived. His nephew did not. And now, in the aftermath, he was nearly alone. The final phase of Snorri's life was a long twilight. His son-in-law, Gizur Thorvaldsson, emerged from the wreckage of Erligstadir as one of the most powerful chieftains in Iceland. So did Kolbein Ungi Arnorsson, another rival who had helped destroy the Sturlungs. These men looked at Snorri, the wealthy, prestigious, politically exposed Snorri, and saw an opportunity. Snorri, for his part, seemed to recognize the danger, but not to act on it. He made one final voyage to Norway in 1237, seeking support from King Hakon, hoping to revive the royal favor that had once made him untouchable. The visit was a disaster. Hakon was no longer the boy King Snorri had first encountered. He was in his early 30s, fully in control of his kingdom, and deeply suspicious of the Icelandic chieftain who had been promising Norwegian sovereignty for 20 years without delivering it. The Jarl Skuli, who had been Snorri's original patron, was now in open rebellion against the king. Snorri had to choose sides. He chose poorly. He maintained his connection to Skuli, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of miscalculation about who would win the coming conflict. When the king discovered this, he stripped Snorri of his Norwegian honors and forbade him from leaving the country. Snorri left anyway. He sailed for Iceland in 1239, in direct defiance of the royal command. He went home to Reykholt, to his hot springs and his manuscripts and the illusion of safety. He had 2 years left. In those years, he may have completed his great literary works. The chronology is uncertain, but most scholars place the final composition of the Prose Edda and the Heimskringla in this period. If so, Snorri spent his final years doing what he had always done best: writing, collecting, preserving, setting down on vellum the stories that would otherwise have died with the men who remembered them. He may have known that time was short. He may have understood that the king's patience had run out, that his enemies in Iceland were circling, that the network of alliances he had spent his life building had collapsed around him. Or he may have believed, as he had always believed, that he could talk his way out of it, that the words would save him, that a settlement could be reached, a deal could be struck, a path forward could be found. The words did not save him. On the night of September 23, 1241, Gizur Thorvaldsson came to Reykholt with 70 armed men. He came with the king's order in hand. Snorri was to be brought to Norway, or he was to be killed. Snorri fled to the cellar. The men followed. Eigi skal hugva. They struck anyway. What died with Snorri Sturluson that night was a man of contradictions, a coward who outlived the brave, a schemer whose schemes all failed, a poet who preferred prose, a chieftain who would not fight, a man who spent his life accumulating power and then could not, or would not, use it to defend himself. But what survived was something else. In the writings he left behind, the Prose Edda, with its systematization of Norse mythology, the Heimskringla, with its narrative of the Norwegian kings, the possible authorship of Egil's saga, with its portrait of a poet-warrior who was everything Snorri himself was not, the old man in the cellar had accomplished something that none of his victories or failures in life could match. He had saved a world. The gods he described, the heroes he chronicled, the myths he preserved, these would have been lost without him. Not entirely, perhaps. Fragments would have survived in other sources. Scholars would have been able to reconstruct something. But the full richness of the Norse mythological world, the stories of Odin sacrificing himself to himself on the world tree, the stories of Thor's battles with the giants, the stories of Ragnarok and the twilight of the gods, these depended on Snorri. He gave them their shape. He gave them their coherence. He gave them the literary form that allowed them to survive the transition from a pagan oral culture to a Christian literate one. And he did this while dying, while his family destroyed itself around him, while the world he had spent his life navigating collapsed into violence, while kings sent orders for his death and sons-in-law carried them out. The cellar at Reykholt was cold. The old man was 62 years old. The sword fell, and the sword fell again. And then there was silence. Above him, in the farmhouse he had built, his manuscripts waited. They would survive the night. They would survive the feuds that followed. They would survive the fall of the Icelandic Commonwealth and the centuries of foreign rule that came after. They are still there. They are still being read. The gods he saved are still remembered. Eigi skal hugva. They struck anyway, but they could not strike the words. The words endured. But to understand why they mattered, why an old man's death in a cellar became one of the most consequential murders in Icelandic history, we must go back. Back before the manuscripts, back before the feuds, back before Snorri Sturluson was anyone at all. He was born in 1179 in a country that did not exist. Iceland in the late 12th century was not a nation in any sense that would be recognizable today. It had no king, it had no army, it had no capital, no taxes, no bureaucracy, no police. What it had was a system so strange, so improbable, so utterly unlike anything else in medieval Europe that historians still argue about what to call it. The Icelandic Commonwealth, they usually say, though the Icelanders themselves simply called it Þjóðveldið, the people's rule. For over 300 years, from the establishment of the Althing in 930 to the submission to the Norwegian crown in 1262, Iceland governed itself through a network of chieftains called godar, free farmers who owed allegiance to whichever chieftain they chose, and an annual assembly where laws were recited, disputes were arbitrated, and the delicate balance of power was renegotiated year after year. It was, in its way, a miracle. A society of perhaps 50,000 people living on an island at the edge of the known world with no natural resources except sheep and fish and the grass that grew in the brief northern summers had created something that worked. Not perfectly, not peacefully. The sagas are full of feuds, killings, burnings, ambushes, and betrayals. But the system held. For 3 centuries, it held. Snorri Sturluson was born into the generation that would break it. His father was Sturla Thordarson, a chieftain of middling importance from the Fam Sturlung family in the west of Iceland. His mother was Gudni Bödvarsdóttir, whose lineage connected her to some of the most powerful families in the country. The marriage was strategic, as all such marriages were. In a society without formal institutions, power flowed through kinship. You were what your family was. You inherited not just land and livestock, but obligations, alliances, feuds, and expectations. The child born to Sturla and Gudni in 1179 entered a world already mapped by the decisions of the dead. But Snorri's early life took an unexpected turn. When he was 3 years old, a legal dispute arose between his father and a priest named Paul Sölvason. The details of the quarrel are lost to us now. Some disagreement over property, perhaps, or honor, or the thousand small frictions that could escalate into violence in a society where violence was the final arbiter of all disputes. What matters is the resolution. Jan Loftsson, the most powerful chieftain in Iceland, intervened. He brokered a settlement, and as part of that settlement, he offered to foster the young Snorri at his estate at Adi. This was not a kidnapping. This was not a punishment. In medieval Icelandic society, fosterage was a mark of honor, a bond between families, a way of cementing alliances and advancing a child's prospects. To be fostered by Jan Loftsson was to be given access to the best education available in Iceland, to be raised among the children of the elite, to be connected from childhood to the networks of power that would determine one's future. Sturla Thordarson accepted. The 3-year-old boy was sent away from his family. He would not return to them for nearly 2 decades. Adi was unlike anywhere else in Iceland. It was the closest thing the country had to a center of learning, a place where books were copied, where Latin was taught, where the old stories were remembered, and the new learning from Europe was absorbed. Jan Loftsson himself was an extraordinary figure, the grandson of King Magnus Barelegs of Norway on his mother's side, which gave him a legitimacy that no other Icelandic chieftain could claim. He was wealthy, cultured, connected to the wider world in ways that most Icelanders could only imagine, and he was a collector, a preserver, a man who understood that the stories mattered. The boy who arrived at Adi in 1181 or 1182 found himself immersed in this world. He learned to read. He learned Latin. He learned the complex meters of skaldic poetry, with their intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, their kennings that transformed simple objects into riddles of mythology. He learned the law, which in Iceland was not written down but memorized and recited, passed from lawspeaker to lawspeaker in an unbroken chain of oral transmission. He learned the sagas, not yet the written texts we know today, but the oral traditions from which those texts would emerge. He learned who his ancestors were. He learned what they had done. He learned that the past was not dead, that it lived in every legal case and every blood feud, that to know where you came from was to know who you were. And he learned to watch, to calculate, to see the patterns of power and obligation that held Icelandic society together. The boy at Adi was not raised to be a warrior. He was not taught to swing a sword or ride into battle. He was taught to think, to negotiate, to find the angle, the leverage, the words that could accomplish what violence could not. This would define him for the rest of his life. It would make him one of the most powerful men in Iceland, and it would, in the end, leave him defenseless in a cellar with 70 armed men outside. Jan Lofsson died in 1197. Snorri was 18 years old. He had spent 15 years at Adi, longer than he had lived with his birth family, longer than he would live anywhere else. The death of his foster father ended his childhood in every meaningful sense. He was now a man, educated and connected, but without land, without a chieftaincy, without the independent power base that he would need to become what he intended to become. What he intended to become was clear from his first adult decision. In 1199, he married Herdís Bersadóttir, the daughter of a wealthy priest named Bersi the Wealthy. The name tells you what mattered about the match. Bersi had land, Bersi had silver, Bersi had an only daughter and no sons to inherit. When Snorri married Herdís, he was not marrying for love, though whether he was capable of that particular emotion is something the sources do not tell us. He was marrying for property, for position, for the material foundation that would allow him to build. The marriage worked, at least in its intended purpose. When Bersi died, Snorri inherited his estate at Borg, one of the most famous locations in Icelandic history. This was the farm where Egil Skallagrimsson had lived in the 10th century, the poet-warrior whose saga Snorri may have written, the man who had composed verses while burying his sons and defied kings with nothing but the power of his words. To live at Borg was to be surrounded by the past, the fields where Egil had walked, the hot springs where he had bathed, the mounds where his ancestors were buried. Snorri understood what this inheritance meant. He was not just acquiring land, he was acquiring legend. But Borg was not enough. Snorri's ambitions extended beyond a single estate, beyond the western fjords where his family had always lived. He wanted more. He wanted what Jan Lofsson had possessed, not just wealth, not just land, but influence. The ability to shape events, the position at the center of the web. In 1206, he acquired it. Through purchase, negotiation, and the careful cultivation of alliances, Snorri obtained the chieftaincy of Reykholt, and more importantly, the estate itself. Reykholt was smaller than Borg, less storied, less famous, but it was better positioned, closer to the roots that connected the different quarters of Iceland, closer to the Althing where power was exercised. And it had something else that Snorri valued: hot springs, natural geothermal pools that could be channeled into baths, heated year-round by the volcanic fires beneath the Icelandic earth. Snorri would spend the rest of his life improving Reykholt, building it into a center of culture and comfort, a place where guests could be entertained and deals could be struck and manuscripts could be written by the warmth of fires that never went out. He moved there with Herdís. He brought his children. He had several by now, legitimate and otherwise, for Snorri's appetites extended beyond what his marriage could contain. He brought his books. He brought his ambitions. And he began with patient deliberation to accumulate power. The mechanism of power in 13th century Iceland was the chieftaincy itself, the Godord. Originally, there had been 39 of these positions distributed across the country, each carrying with it the right to lead followers, to represent them at the Althing, to collect fees for legal services and to exercise a kind of informal authority that was simultaneously political, religious, and economic. By Snorri's time, the system had begun to concentrate. Chieftaincies could be bought, sold, inherited, divided, and accumulated. A man could hold multiple godords simultaneously. A man could become, through acquisition rather than conquest, something that looked almost like a king. Snorri understood this. He began to collect chieftaincies the way other men collected livestock. One godord, then another, then another. By the time he reached the height of his power, he held more chieftaincies than any other man in Iceland. He was not the only one playing this game. His rivals were doing the same thing, and the competition between accumulating chieftains would eventually tear the Commonwealth apart. But he was among the most successful. For 2 decades, from roughly 1215 to 1235, Snorri Sturluson was one of the 3 or 4 most powerful men in the country. And in 1215, he achieved the position that formalized this power. He was elected lawspeaker at the Althing. The lawspeaker was the closest thing Iceland had to a head of state, though the comparison is misleading. He had no executive power. He commanded no army. He could not make laws, only recite them. His function was to stand on the law rock at Thingvellir and speak, to recite the entire body of Icelandic law over the course of the assembly, 1/3 each year, so that the knowledge would be preserved and the people would know their rights and obligations. It was a position of enormous prestige. It was a position of almost no practical power. And it was for Snorri exactly what he wanted, because the law speaker stood at the center. The law speaker heard every dispute, witnessed every negotiation, understood every faction and alliance and grudge. The law speaker was the memory of the system, and in a society that ran on memory, on who had done what to whom, on which families owed blood and which owed silver, on the intricate genealogies that determined everything from inheritance rights to blood feud obligations, the man who held the memory held a kind of power that could not be taken from him. Snorri served as law speaker from 1215 to 1218. He would serve again, later, from 1222 to 1231. Nearly a quarter of his adult life was spent in this position, and during those years, he watched the system he had mastered begin to fail. The problem was concentration. The old balance of power, 39 chieftains, none strong enough to dominate, all forced to negotiate and compromise, had given way to something new. By the 1220s, there were perhaps half a dozen families that mattered, each controlling multiple chieftaincies, each locked in competition with the others: the Sturlungs, Snorri's family, the Haukdalier, the Asbjörningar, the Svinfellingar. These were no longer chieftains in the old sense. These were factions, these were power blocks, and the methods they used to compete were no longer the patient negotiations and legal maneuverings that had characterized the Commonwealth at its height. They burned each other's farms. They ambushed each other on the roads. They killed each other's sons and brothers and allies. The period from 1220 to 1262 would become known as the Sturlungaöld, the Age of the Sturlungs, not because Snorri's family was uniquely violent, but because they were at the center of the violence, both as perpetrators and as victims. The age took its name from them because their saga, the Sturlunga saga, is the primary source for the period, and that saga is a chronicle of destruction. Snorri watched this happen. He participated in it. He maneuvered and schemed and accumulated, always seeking advantage, always seeking the deal that would advance his position. But there is something curious in the sources, something that sets him apart from his brothers and nephews and rivals. Snorri rarely killed anyone himself. He rarely led men into battle. When violence erupted, he was somehow always elsewhere, always negotiating, always trying to find the settlement that would end the fighting without anyone having to die. His critics called him a coward. His defenders might call him a realist. Perhaps he simply understood, in a way that his more martial relatives did not, that the game was changing, that the old rules no longer applied, that the violence-consuming Iceland was not a series of feuds that could be settled, but a structural collapse that would end only when someone imposed order from outside, that someone would be the king of Norway. And Snorri, in one of the great miscalculations of his life, thought he could manage that too. In 1218, between his 2 terms as lawspeaker, Snorri received an invitation. King Håkon Håkonarsson of Norway, young, ambitious, determined to extend his authority over all the Norse-speaking lands, asked Snorri to visit his court. The invitation was an honor. It was also a trap, but Snorri, confident in his ability to navigate any situation, accepted. He sailed for Norway in the summer of 1218. He would not return for 2 years. The court, he found, was unlike anything in Iceland. Håkon was 17 years old and had been king since he was 13, though real power had rested with his regent, Earl Skuli, until recently. The Norwegian court was wealthy, sophisticated, connected to the wider European world of kings and princes and papal politics. It had books that Snorri had never seen. It had music, art, ceremony, all the trappings of monarchy that Iceland had rejected 3 centuries before. And it had something else, a clear hierarchy, a chain of command, a center of authority that did not require endless negotiation and compromise. Snorri was fascinated. He was also, the sources suggest, seduced. The king showered him with gifts. Earl Skuli, who remained powerful despite the young king's coming of age, cultivated him as an ally. Snorri was made a skutilsvein, a courtier of high rank, a position of honor in the Norwegian hierarchy. He was treated as what he had always believed himself to be, a man of importance, a man whose words mattered, a man who could speak to kings as an equal. And the kings asked him to do something in return. They asked him to bring Iceland under Norwegian rule. The request was not phrased so bluntly, of course. Politics never is. What Håkon and Skuli suggested was that Snorri could help them, that he could use his influence, his chieftaincies, his position as lawspeaker to encourage the Icelanders to accept the king's authority, that there would be rewards for this service, more honors, more wealth, perhaps a formal position in the Norwegian administration of what would become a Norwegian province. They did not say, "Betray your country." They said, "Help us bring peace." Snorri listened. He calculated. He accepted their gifts. And then he went home. What happened next is the subject of historical debate. Did Snorri genuinely intend to fulfill his promise to the Norwegian king? Did he believe that Norwegian rule was inevitable and that he might as well position himself to benefit from it? Or did he simply tell Håkon what Håkon wanted to hear, accepting the honors and the gifts with no intention of delivering anything in return? The evidence suggests the latter. Snorri returned to Iceland in 1220. He resumed his position at the center of Icelandic politics. He served his 2nd term as lawspeaker. He continued his literary work, compiling the Prose Edda and perhaps beginning the Heimskringla. But he did not work to bring Iceland under Norwegian rule. He did not mobilize his chieftaincies in the king's service. He did not, in any meaningful sense, fulfill the promises he had made. Perhaps he had never intended to. Perhaps he believed he could string the Norwegians along indefinitely, enjoying their favor without ever paying the price. Perhaps he underestimated how seriously Håkon took his ambitions, how determined the young king was to bring all the Norse-speaking lands under his crown. If so, it was a miscalculation that would cost him everything. The years after Snorri's return from Norway were the years of his greatest literary achievement and his greatest political vulnerability. The feuds intensified. His own family turned against itself. His brother Sigvatr became his rival. His nephews killed and were killed. His sons disappointed him. One died young, another proved incompetent. A third turned against him. His daughters married men who would become his enemies. The network of alliances he had built began to unravel, thread by thread, as the violence consumed everyone around him. And across the sea, King Håkon waited. The king had not forgotten Snorri's promises. The king had not forgotten Snorri's failure to deliver. And as the chaos in Iceland deepened, as the great families destroyed each other in an escalating spiral of revenge, the king saw his opportunity. If the Icelanders would not submit voluntarily, they would submit because they had no other choice. The violence would exhaust them. The old system would collapse, and when it did, Norway would be there to pick up the pieces. Snorri, for all his intelligence, for all his calculating mind, seems not to have understood this. He continued to scheme. He continued to negotiate. He continued to believe that he could find a way out, that the words would save him, that a deal could always be struck. In 1237, he made another trip to Norway. This time, the welcome was colder. Håkon was no longer a teenage king dependent on advisors and regents. He was a man in his 30s, secure in his power, impatient with those who had failed him. He received Snorri with formal courtesy and made his expectations clear. Snorri was to return to Iceland and use his influence to bring the country under Norwegian authority. This was not a suggestion. This was an order. Snorri stayed in Norway for 2 years. He enjoyed Earl Skúli's hospitality, the same Earl Skúli who was now in open conflict with King Håkon, whose ambitions would lead to civil war and his own death. Snorri seems to have aligned himself with Skúli against the king, perhaps believing that Skúli would prevail, perhaps simply unable to resist the comfort and the flattery. When he finally decided to return to Iceland in 1239, Håkon forbade him to leave. He left anyway. This was the final miscalculation. This was the moment when words stopped being enough. Håkon sent orders to Iceland. Snorri was to be brought to Norway, or he was to be killed. The king's choice of executioner was deliberate. He did not send Norwegian soldiers. He sent the order to Gizur Thorvaldsson, Snorri's own son-in-law, a man with his own reasons for wanting Snorri dead. The old man returned to Reykholt. He had 2 years left. He spent them writing, perhaps, watching the feuds consume what remained of his family, waiting for the blow that he must have known was coming. The summer of 1241 came to Iceland as all summers came, brief, pale, the grass greening on the slopes above Reykholt, while the snow lingered on the higher peaks. Snorri was 62 years old. His hair had gone white. His body, never lean, had thickened further with age and inactivity. He moved slowly now, the man who had once ridden the length of Iceland to attend assemblies and negotiate marriages. The hot spring still fed his pool. The manuscripts still accumulated in his hall. The servants still attended to his needs. But the world beyond Reykholt had become a killing ground, and the killing was coming closer. Gizur Thorvaldsson had been preparing for months, the son-in-law, the chieftain of the Haukdalir, one of the most powerful families in Iceland, the man who had married Snorri's daughter Ingibjorg, and then watched that marriage curdle into hatred. The sources disagree on the precise sequence of grievances, but the broad shape is consistent. Gizur believed Snorri had cheated him. Land disputes, inheritance claims, the endless petty cruelties that accumulate between men who once trusted each other and no longer do. When King Håkon's order arrived, bring Snorri to Norway or kill him, Gizur did not hesitate. He had been given permission to do what he already wanted to do. The order itself deserves examination. Håkon was a careful king, a king who understood the value of legality, who spent his reign codifying laws and establishing precedents. He did not simply order murder. The letter that reached Iceland gave Gizur options: capture Snorri and send him to Norway to face the king's justice, or, if that proved impossible, ensure that he never defied the crown again. The ambiguity was deliberate. It gave Håkon deniability. It gave Gizur latitude, and it placed the moral burden on the executioner rather than the king who had commanded him. This was statecraft. This was how power worked. Snorri would have understood it perfectly, had understood it, had practiced it himself for decades. The irony is almost too neat. The man who had spent his life manipulating the levers of influence, who had written more eloquently than anyone about the cunning of kings and the fate of those who defied them, could not see the machinery closing around his own throat. Or perhaps he could. The sources suggest that Snorri received warnings in those final months. Men came to Reykholt with rumors. Gizur was gathering forces. Gizur had received correspondence from Norway. Gizur was coming. Snorri's response, as recorded by the saga writers who came after, was peculiar. He did not flee. He did not fortify. He did not summon his remaining allies to defend him. He seems to have simply waited, as if the situation might resolve itself, as if the words might still save him, as if Gizur, approaching with armed men, might be talked out of it when he arrived. This passivity demands explanation, and the sources do not provide one. Was it exhaustion? After 62 years, after the deaths of sons and the betrayals of daughters, after watching his family tear itself apart, Had Snorri simply lost the will to struggle? Was it miscalculation? The lifelong schemer convinced until the last moment that a deal could be struck, that Gizur would take him prisoner rather than kill him, that King Haakon would eventually relent? Was it denial, the mind refusing to accept what the evidence clearly indicated? We cannot know. We can only observe that Snorri, who had spent his life in motion, chose in his final weeks to remain still. The night came on September 23, 1241. The date is secure in the sources, a Thursday according to the reckoning. The autumn equinox had just passed, the days and nights briefly equal before the long darkness took hold. Reykholt lay quiet. Most of the household had gone to sleep. Snorri had been at supper earlier. The saga mentions this, an oddly domestic detail amid the violence to come. He had eaten, he had spoken with those present, then he had retired to his quarters. Gizur brought 70 men. The number is significant. This was not an assassination party. This was an army. 70 armed men riding through the Icelandic night toward a settlement defended by a handful of servants and an old man. Gizur was taking no chances. He had seen too many revenge killings fail because the attackers underestimated their quarry. He had seen cornered men fight with desperate strength. He had seen apparently successful murders become the seeds of generations-spanning blood feuds. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it with overwhelming force. They arrived at Reykholt in the darkness before dawn. The settlement had no walls. Iceland had no tradition of fortification, no castles in the European sense, no keeps or moats or murder holes. The buildings were wood and turf, arranged around the central hall and the famous pool. Gizur's men surrounded the complex. They blocked the exits. They waited for the signal. What happened next has been told and retold, each version adding details, each version shaped by the teller's sympathies. But certain elements remain constant across all the accounts. Snorri was awakened by the noise, voices outside, the sound of many horses, the unmistakable clamor of men preparing for violence. He rose from his bed. He was wearing only his sleeping clothes, no mail, no weapons, nothing that might serve as defense. He went to the door and looked out. He saw the torches. He saw the ring of armed men. He understood in that moment exactly what was happening. And he ran. Not toward the attackers, not toward some hopeless last stand. He ran toward the cellar. Beneath his hall, there was a storage space, a cold room dug into the earth where provisions were kept through the long winters. It had a door. It had darkness. It was the only place he could think to hide. 70 men, one old man in his nightclothes. The mathematics of this encounter were not complicated. But Snorri ran anyway. The body's reflexes, operating beneath the mind's calculations, the animal insistence on survival, even when survival was impossible. He reached the cellar. He descended the stairs. He closed the door behind him. Above, Gizur's men poured into the hall. They searched the chambers. They found his bed still warm, his sleeping clothes abandoned. They knew he had not escaped. The exits were blocked, the settlement surrounded. He was here. He was hiding. It was only a matter of finding him. The search took time. Reykholt was a substantial complex, the seat of one of Iceland's wealthiest chieftains. There were outbuildings, storage rooms, the quarters of servants and retainers. Gizur's men moved through them systematically, torches held high, weapons ready. The night was wearing toward dawn. The eastern sky was beginning to gray. They found the cellar. 5 men descended the stairs. The saga names them, preserves their identities for posterity. Arni the Bitter, Thorstein Gudnason, Simon Knutur, Marcus Marderson, and one other whose name varies across the manuscripts. These were the men who would kill Snorri Sturluson. These were the men who would end the life that had produced the Prose Edda and the Heimskringla. History remembers them only for this. The cellar was dark. The torchlight pushed back the shadows but did not dispel them. The space was low-ceilinged, crowded with barrels and provisions, the smell of earth and stored food thick in the air. Snorri was somewhere in that darkness. The men advanced. They found him pressed against the far wall, cornered, nowhere left to run. What followed has become one of the most famous exchanges in Icelandic literature. Snorri, looking at the men who had come to kill him, spoke. He did not plead. He did not threaten. He made a statement. Eigi skal hugva. "Do not strike." The words have been analyzed endlessly. What did they mean? Was this a command? The lawspeaker invoking legal authority, forbidding violence? Was it a plea? The old man begging for his life? Was it an offer of negotiation? "Do not strike yet. Let us talk first." Was it a legal formula? Words that might have some binding force in Icelandic law, some requirement that the attackers pause and consider. The most likely interpretation, according to most scholars, is that Snorri was attempting to invoke the legal protections due to any Icelander. Strike him, and you become outlaws. Strike him, and the law turns against you. Strike him, and every kinsman of his, every ally, every man who ever owed him a debt will be obligated to pursue vengeance. The words were a reminder of consequences. A last attempt to use the system he had spent his life manipulating. The men struck anyway. Arni the Bitter raised his weapon first. The sagas do not specify what kind, sword, axe, something else, only that the blow fell. Then the others joined. 5 men against 1 unarmed old man in a cellar beneath his own hall. It did not take long. Snorri Sturluson died in the darkness, surrounded by the provisions he had stored for a winter he would never see. He died under the weapons of men his son-in-law had sent. He died because he had promised a foreign king something he could not deliver, because he had aligned himself with that king's enemy, because he had left Norway against explicit orders, because a lifetime of schemes had finally produced a scheme he could not escape. He was 62 years old. Above, as the dawn light strengthened, Gizur Thorvaldsson took possession of Reykholt. The estate, the lands, the wealth that Snorri had accumulated over decades, all of it passed to his killer. The manuscripts remained, the Prose Edda remained, the Heimskringla remained. Whatever Snorri had been working on in those final years, whatever projects lay half-finished on his writing desk, remained for others to complete or abandon as they saw fit. The words had outlasted the man who wrote them. This is where most accounts of Snorri's death pause, satisfied with the dramatic irony, the great poet killed by men who would never understand what they had destroyed. But the aftermath matters as much as the moment. Gizur did not simply walk away. The killing unleashed consequences that would shape Iceland for a generation. In the immediate term, Gizur faced surprisingly little resistance. He had acted with the king's authority, or at least the king's tacit approval. He had overwhelming force. The remaining Sturlings were scattered, weakened by 2 decades of fratricidal violence. Snorri's surviving relatives were in no position to mount effective retaliation. Gizur consolidated his gains. He became one of the most powerful chieftains in Iceland, but power in this period was a poisoned gift. The same forces that had destroyed Snorri would continue to grind through the Icelandic elite. Gizur himself would lose sons to the feuds. He would see alliances shift and break. He would eventually, in 1262, submit to Norwegian rule, the very outcome Snorri had been supposed to engineer and had failed to deliver. In the end, all the blood accomplished what Håkon had intended from the beginning. Iceland became a dependency of the Norwegian crown. The Commonwealth, 300 years old, came to an end. The king, for his part, distanced himself from the murder almost immediately. Håkon expressed formal displeasure at the news from Reykholt. Snorri should have been brought to Norway, not killed. The execution had been excessive. Gizur had exceeded his mandate. These protestations were largely pro forma. Håkon needed Gizur and men like him to pacify Iceland, and public condemnation of the killing cost the king nothing. But the statement matters for what it reveals about medieval statecraft. Even in an age of routine violence, even among kings who ordered deaths without hesitation, there were protocols. There were ways things were supposed to be done. Snorri's murder was useful to Håkon, but also, in some sense, embarrassing. The great literary figure of the age had been cut down in his cellar like a common outlaw. And the manuscripts, what became of the manuscripts? This is perhaps the most remarkable element of the aftermath. They survived. The prose. Edda was already in circulation by 1241. Copies had been made. Students had studied it. The work had begun its long journey through Scandinavian culture, eventually reaching the wider world. Whatever chaos followed Snorri's death, Whatever disruptions shook Reykholt and the Sturlunger holdings, the book itself was beyond danger. It had achieved the immortality that its author would not. The Heimskringla is harder to trace. Scholars debate when exactly Snorri completed it, whether the work we have represents his final intentions or an earlier draft, whether editors after his death shaped the text we read today. But the essential fact is the same. It survived. The saga of the Norwegian kings, from mythological Inglings to 12th century monarchs, passed into the historical record. It became, over the centuries, the foundational text for understanding Norway's past. It became the lens through which we see Harald Fairhair and Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Saint and all the others. The man died in a cellar. The words walked out into the world. It is tempting here to find comfort in this, to say that the pen proved mightier than the sword, that Snorri achieved through literature what he failed to achieve through politics. And there is truth in that temptation. His killers are footnotes. He is the subject of documentaries. But the comfort is perhaps too easy. The man who died in that cellar was not a pure vessel for art. He was a politician who wrote, a schemer who also composed. The literary works were not separate from the ambitions. They were part of them. Snorri wrote the Prose Edda in part to demonstrate his learning to foreign patrons. He wrote the Heimskringla in part to curry favor with Norwegian kings. The beauty of the work is real. The calculation behind it is also real. Both things are true. And the question that lingers, the question that the sources cannot answer, is whether Snorri himself understood what he had made. Did he know, in those final years at Reykholt, that the books would outlast him? Did he sense that he was building something permanent even as his political position crumbled? Or was he until the end primarily concerned with the mundane matters of land and alliance and survival? The prose. Edda opens with a vision of the cosmos, Ginnunga Gap, the great void, the fire and ice, the creation of the worlds. The Heimskringla opens with Odin, the wandering god, leading his people into Scandinavia. These are foundational myths, origin stories, attempts to explain where the world came from and why it is the way it is. Did the man who wrote them see himself as part of some larger story? Or did he see himself as what he was in the immediate, a wealthy chieftain with enemies, a man trying to navigate impossible circumstances, a father whose children had failed him? We cannot know. We have only the texts and the silence around them. The cellar at Reykholt no longer exists. The site has been excavated, studied, rebuilt as a memorial. Tourists visit. They see the hot spring, the pool where Snorri once bathed. They see the modern church that stands near where his hall once stood. They learn the story of the great writer and his violent end. But the earth that absorbed his blood has been turned and turned again. The barrels he hid among rotted centuries ago. The darkness he died in has been replaced by interpretive signage and visitor centers. This is what happens to places where history occurred. They become heritage. They become safe. The terror drains out of them. The cellar where 5 men killed an old man becomes a point of interest, a fact to be learned and forgotten, a paragraph in a guidebook. This is probably inevitable. We cannot live permanently in the presence of the past's violence. We have to tame it, domesticate it, make it consumable. But occasionally, briefly, it is worth trying to feel the weight of the moment itself. September 23rd, 1241. The darkness before dawn. An old man in his night clothes pressed against the wall of his own cellar, watching the torches descend the stairs. The certain knowledge that no words will save him now, the raising of the weapon, the blow. Egi skal hugva. Do not strike. They struck, and then the body cooled. The men who had done the work climbed back up the stairs. They emerged into a house that was no longer Snorri's. They walked through rooms that still held his possessions, past shelves that may have held his manuscripts, through a hall that had hosted skalds and chieftains and the agents of kings. The blood on their weapons was already beginning to dry. The body in the cellar was already beginning to stiffen. And somewhere in the darkness of that September morning, the question of what came next began to press upon them. Gizur Thorvaldsson had accomplished what he set out to accomplish. The old man was dead. The instructions from Norway had been followed. after a fashion. But the killing of a man as prominent as Snorri Sturluson was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. And Gizur, standing in the hall of the man he had just murdered, must have understood that the consequences of this night would unfold for years, perhaps decades, perhaps longer than anyone present could imagine. The political mathematics were complex. Snorri had been, despite his diminished position, one of the most prominent chieftains in Iceland. His network of alliances, though frayed, still existed. His sons were dead, yes, but he had other relatives, other connections, other men who might feel obligated to avenge him. The killing had been done in the name of King Haakon of Norway, but Haakon was far away, across hundreds of miles of ocean, and the men who would have to live with the aftermath were here, in Iceland, surrounded by the families and followers of the man they had just cut down. This is the arithmetic of violence that the sagas understand intimately. A killing creates a debt. The debt must be paid in blood or in silver. The family of the slain man has the right, more than the right, the obligation, to seek compensation. If compensation is not forthcoming, feud is inevitable. The cycle continues. The original killing produces secondary killings, which produce tertiary killings, which produce a cascade of violence that can consume entire families, entire districts, entire generations. The Icelanders had laws to manage this. They had systems of arbitration, of compensation, of outlawry. But the laws only worked if all parties agreed to abide by them. And when the killing in question was politically motivated, when it had the backing of a foreign king, when the victim was one of the most famous men in the country, the laws might not be enough. Snorri's body lay in the cellar as the sun rose over Reykholt. We do not know exactly what happened in the hours that followed. The sources are sparse here, focused on the drama of the killing itself rather than the mundane business of its aftermath. But we can infer the general shape. The body would have been retrieved. It would have been washed, dressed, prepared for burial according to the customs of the time. A man of Snorri's wealth and prominence would have received a Christian burial, a funeral mass, interment in consecrated ground. The church had long since established its authority over the rituals of death in Iceland. Whatever pagan echoes lingered in the culture, the mechanics of burial were Christian. We do not know where Snorri was buried. This is one of the many silences that surround his death. A man who had been one of the most documented figures of his time, whose movements and marriages and political maneuvers were recorded in multiple sources, disappears into obscurity at the moment of his death. The body goes into the ground somewhere, and the ground keeps its secret. Later generations would search for his grave. They would speculate about its location. They would not find it. The man who preserved so much of the past left no monument to mark his own ending. But even as the body was being prepared for burial, the political consequences were beginning to unfold. News of the killing spread across Iceland with the speed that news traveled in a society of dispersed farms and seasonal gatherings, slowly by modern standards, but relentlessly. Within days, every chieftain in the country would know that Snorri Sturluson was dead. Within weeks, they would know the circumstances. Within months, they would have begun to calculate what it meant for their own positions, their own alliances, their own futures. The immediate beneficiary was, of course, Gizur Thorvaldsson. With Snorri dead, the balance of power in southwestern Iceland shifted. Properties that had been under Snorri's control were now available for redistribution. Alliances that had centered on Reykholt would have to find new anchors. Gizur, as the man who had executed the killing, was well positioned to claim at least some of the spoils. He had demonstrated his willingness to act decisively. He had shown that he had the backing of the Norwegian king. He had proven himself a man to be reckoned with, but the gains came with costs. Gizur had made enemies. Some of them were powerful. And the manner of the killing, the midnight raid, the unarmed victim, the words that might have been a plea for mercy, cast a shadow over the accomplishment. There is a difference in the moral economy of the sagas between killing a man in open combat and killing him in his cellar. The former is honorable, even admirable. The latter is something else. Gizur had accomplished his goal, but he had accomplished it in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. The saga literature that emerged from this period, the works that documented the final decades of the Icelandic Commonwealth, would remember the killing of Snorri as one of the signal events of the age. It would be woven into the larger narrative of family feuds and foreign interference that defined the 13th century. It would be cited as evidence of the decline of Icelandic independence, the corruption of the old ways, the creeping influence of Norwegian royal power. Snorri's death became a symbol. Whether he would have appreciated the symbolism is another question entirely. King Haakon in Norway received the news with whatever satisfaction he derived from the elimination of a troublesome subordinate, the man who had defied his orders, who had failed to deliver on his promises, who had become an embarrassment and an obstacle. That man was dead. The Norwegian project to bring Iceland under royal control could proceed with one less complication. But Haakon was a sophisticated political operator. He understood that the killing of Snorri, while useful, was not sufficient. Iceland remained independent. The other chieftains remained in place. The structures of the Commonwealth, weakened though they were, still functioned. More work would be needed. More pressure would have to be applied. The final absorption of Iceland into the Norwegian kingdom would not occur for another 20 years, in 1262. But the killing of Snorri was part of the process. It was one of the many small violences that, accumulated over decades, broke the resistance of the Icelandic elite and made submission to the crown seem eventually inevitable. This is one of the ironies that the history offers. Snorri had traveled to Norway twice. He had accepted honors from the king. He had made promises of service. He had been, in his way, an agent of Norwegian influence in Iceland. And yet, his death was ordered by that same king because he had failed to deliver on his promises, because he had proven unreliable, because he had prioritized his own interests over those of his patron. The man who had been willing to serve was killed for not serving well enough. The man who had sought Norwegian favor was destroyed by that same favor when it turned against him. The relationship between Iceland and Norway was in these decades a relationship of seduction and violence, of promises made and broken, of gifts given and withdrawn. Snorri's life and death embodied all of it. But there is another way to read the aftermath, a longer view that requires stepping back from the immediate politics. In the years that followed Snorri's death, his works began to circulate. The Prose Edda was copied. The Heimskringla was read. The manuscripts traveled from Reykholt to other centers of learning, to other churches and chieftains who valued such things. Iceland in the 13th century was a society that took writing seriously. It had one of the highest literacy rates in medieval Europe. It produced more literature per capita than any other country of its time. And into this culture of textual production, Snorri's works entered as major contributions, perhaps the major contributions. We cannot trace the exact path of the manuscripts. We do not have the first copies, the originals that Snorri himself may have supervised. What we have are later copies, copies of copies, the products of a tradition of scribal transmission that preserved the texts while also inevitably changing them. Each copyist introduced variations, errors, emendations. Each generation of readers brought new interpretations. By the time the manuscripts reached the scholars of the 17th and 18th centuries, the antiquarians who recognized their value and began the serious work of preservation and study, they had passed through many hands. The texts we read today are reconstructions, best guesses, scholarly assemblages based on imperfect evidence. But the core is there. The voice is there. Snorri's voice, or something very close to it, speaking across the centuries. The Prose Edda became the standard reference for Norse mythology. When scholars wanted to understand the gods of the Vikings, they turned to Snorri. When poets wanted to use the old kennings and meters, they consulted his manual. When artists wanted to depict Odin or Thor, they drew on his descriptions. The images we have of Norse mythology, the one-eyed god on his eight-legged horse, the red-bearded thunder god with his hammer, the trickster god bound beneath the serpent's venom, these images come largely from Snorri. He did not invent them. He collected them, organized them, made them accessible. But in doing so, he shaped them. His choices about what to include and what to exclude, his interpretations of ambiguous sources, his literary sensibility, all of this became embedded in the tradition. We see Norse mythology through Snorri's eyes because his are the eyes that were preserved. The Heimskringla had an even more direct impact on the political consciousness of Scandinavia. It became the history of the Norwegian kings, the authoritative account against which other accounts were measured. Later, historians drew on it. Later, kings invoked it. The sense of Norwegian identity that developed over the centuries, the understanding of what Norway was and where it came from, was shaped in profound ways by Snorri's narrative. He had written the book, in part, to please King Haakon. He had designed it as a gift, a demonstration of loyalty and learning. But the book outlived both the author and the king. It became something larger than either of them had intended. It became a foundation. This is what makes Snorri's death so peculiar, so difficult to process. The man who was killed in a cellar in 1241 was, from one perspective, a failed politician, a schemer whose schemes had collapsed, an ambitious man whose ambitions had outrun his abilities. But from another perspective, the longer perspective, he was one of the most successful authors in European history. The books he wrote are still read. The mythology he preserved is still invoked. The kings he chronicled are still remembered largely because he chronicled them. The calculation behind his writing, the political motives, the desire to impress foreign patrons, does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more interesting. He was not a pure artist working in isolation. He was a man embedded in the politics of his time, writing for specific audiences and specific purposes. And yet the work transcended those purposes. It outlived them. It acquired meanings and uses that Snorri could never have anticipated. Would he have been gratified to know this? It is impossible to say. The sources do not record his thoughts about posterity. We have his works, but we do not have his reflections on those works. He may have understood that he was creating something lasting. The care he took, the comprehensiveness of his approach, the literary quality of the writing, all of this suggests a man who was thinking beyond the immediate occasion. But he may also have been primarily concerned with the near-term payoff, the political advantage, the impression he would make on powerful patrons. The two motivations are not incompatible. Great works are often produced by people who are thinking about both art and advantage, both posterity and the present moment. Snorri was such a person. He wanted to be remembered, and he wanted to be powerful. He achieved the first and failed at the second. Whether he would have accepted that trade-off had he known it in advance is one of the many questions the silence of the past refuses to answer. The decades that followed his death saw the unraveling of the world he had known. The Icelandic Commonwealth, that unique experiment in stateless governance, could not survive the pressures bearing down on it. The chieftains who had wielded power for generations found their authority eroding. The Norwegian kings, patient and persistent, continued their campaign of influence. The church, increasingly aligned with royal power, added its weight to the scales. The culmination came in 1262 and 1264, when the Icelandic chieftains, one district at a time, submitted to the sovereignty of the Norwegian crown. The thing that Snorri had refused to help accomplish, the thing that had, in a sense, cost him his life, happened anyway. Iceland became a dependency of Norway. The old order ended. The chieftains who had ruled through personal power and complex networks of alliance became, gradually, administrators of a distant king. The Commonwealth became a memory. Some historians see this as inevitable. The Commonwealth, they argue, was always unstable, always violent, always one catastrophic feud away from collapse. The Norwegian intervention merely accelerated a process that was already underway. Others see it as a tragedy, the destruction of a remarkable political system by external aggression and internal corruption. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. The Commonwealth had real strengths and real weaknesses. It survived for over 3 centuries, which is longer than many political systems manage. It produced a literature that remains unmatched for its depth and psychological complexity. It fostered a culture of law and negotiation that, while imperfect, was in many ways more sophisticated than what existed elsewhere in medieval Europe. And then it ended. The violence that had always been present in the system, the feuds, the killings, the cycles of revenge, reached a point where it could no longer be contained. The external pressures became too great. The elite made the calculation that submission was better than continued chaos. The Commonwealth died not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a gradual, exhausted surrender. Snorri would not have been surprised by any of this. He had lived his entire adult life in the midst of these pressures. He had navigated them, sometimes skillfully, sometimes disastrously. He had seen the direction things were moving. He had understood, perhaps better than most, the forces that were reshaping his world. This understanding is woven into his works. The Heimskringla is, among other things, a meditation on power, how it is acquired, how it is maintained, how it slips away. The kings in his narrative are constantly struggling against rivals, against the old families, against the centrifugal forces that threaten to tear their kingdoms apart. The successful ones are ruthless and patient. The unsuccessful ones are either too soft or too hasty. Snorri observed these patterns. He recorded them. He may even have tried to learn from them. But the lesson of the Heimskringla, if there is one, is that power is inherently unstable. Even the greatest kings die. Even the strongest dynasties fade. The wheel turns. The man who sits at the top today will be remembered tomorrow only if he is fortunate enough to have a chronicler. Snorri had been his own chronicler, in a sense. By writing the histories of the Norwegian kings, he had made a claim for his own importance. He was the man who knew these stories. He was the man who could render them in polished prose and intricate verse. His value to the Norwegian court was, in part, the value of a skilled propagandist. But he had also been a subject of the very narratives he shaped. The sagas that document the 13th century, the works that were written by others, by people who came after, include Snorri as a character. He appears in these texts as he appeared in life, ambitious, learned, wealthy, politically engaged, ultimately tragic. The man who wrote about others became someone about whom others wrote. The chronicler became the chronicled. This is a fate that few historians achieve. It is a strange kind of immortality. The night of September 23, 1241, remains vivid in the sources because it was meant to be vivid. The men who recorded it understood its symbolic weight. They knew they were describing a moment that mattered. The details they preserved, the cellar, the darkness, the final words, are the details that transform a political killing into a story. They are the details that lodge in memory and refuse to fade. We do not remember every chieftain who was killed in medieval Iceland. Most of them are forgotten, their deaths reduced to footnotes or lost entirely. But we remember Snorri's death because it was told in a way that made it memorable. The irony is that the techniques used to tell it were techniques that Snorri himself had mastered. The saga style that renders his death so vividly is the saga style that he helped to perfect. He taught his culture how to tell stories, and then his culture used those techniques to tell the story of his end. The question of what Snorri knew in those final weeks is one the sources cannot definitively answer, but the shape of events suggests that he understood. The summer of 1241 had been a summer of gathering shadows. Messages had passed between Norway and Iceland. Names had been spoken in halls where Snorri had once been welcomed as a guest. The king's patience, never infinite, had finally reached its end. Hakon Hakonarsson had waited years for Snorri to fulfill his promises. The chieftain had returned to Iceland in 1239 against explicit royal orders, had failed to deliver the submission of the Icelandic chieftains, had maneuvered and delayed and equivocated until the king's trust had curdled into something colder. The relationship that had once been built on mutual benefit, the king gaining a skilled propagandist and potential agent, Snorri gaining prestige and protection, had become a liability for both parties. But it was a liability that weighed more heavily on the man who was farther from the swords. The order, when it came, was addressed to Gissur Thorvaldsson. The exact wording has not survived. What has survived is the understanding that Gissur was instructed to bring Snorri to Norway, or, if that proved impossible, to ensure that he would never leave Iceland again. The ambiguity in this instruction was not accidental. Medieval kings often preferred their orders to contain plausible deniability. If Snorri came willingly, Hakon would have his prize. If Snorri resisted, if something unfortunate happened, well, the king had only asked for his presence in Norway. Whatever occurred in the process of fulfilling that request was the responsibility of the men on the ground. Gizur was well suited to receive such an order. He had been Snorri's son-in-law, married to Ingebjorg, one of Snorri's daughters. The marriage had been part of the endless network of alliances that Icelandic chieftains wove and unwove. But the alliance had soured. Gizur had his own ambitions, his own grievances, his own calculations about the future. He had been involved in the feuds that had consumed the Sturlungar. He had blood on his hands and blood debts owed to him. The violence of the previous decades had made him into a man capable of what came next. There were others involved. Kolbein the Young, another powerful chieftain, was part of the conspiracy. The sources name additional men: Arni the Bitter, Marcus Martyrsson, others whose faces have blurred with time. They gathered their forces in the late summer. They made their plans. They waited for the moment. Snorri, meanwhile, was at Reykholt. The estate he had built over decades, the place that represented his wealth and his taste and his ambition, had become something close to a prison. He was 62 years old, which was old for that time and place. He had lost much of the influence he had once commanded. The death of his nephew, Sturla Sigvatsson, at Urligstadir in 1238, had been a catastrophe for his faction. Sturla had been the most capable military leader among the Sturlungar, and his death, along with his father Sigvatar, Snorri's brother, had left the family exposed. Snorri himself had never been a warrior. His weapons were words and wealth, not swords and spears. In a world where violence had become the primary language of politics, he was increasingly inarticulate. The late summer at Reykholt would have been beautiful. Iceland in August and September offers long twilights, the last warmth before the darkness descends. The grass would have been green in the hayfields. The hot springs that fed Snorri's famous pool would have sent their steam rising into the cool air. The manuscript books in his scriptorium, the Edda, the Heimskringla, the poems and genealogies and legal texts, sat in their places, representing decades of labor. Whatever else had failed in Snorri's life, those books remained. They were solid. They were finished. They would outlast everything else. Did he know the men were coming? Some historians have suggested that he did, that warnings had reached him, that he could have fled if he had chosen to. Others argue that the attack came as a complete surprise, that Gizur and his men moved quickly and secretly. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions. Snorri may have known that danger was approaching in a general sense. The political situation made that obvious to anyone paying attention, without knowing the specific night or the specific men. He may have believed that his wealth could still buy him safety, that his fame could still protect him, that the men who had once been his allies would not actually strike. He had survived so much already. Why would this time be different? September 23rd, 1241. The equinox, or very close to it. The day when light and darkness are balanced before the scales tip toward winter. There is no evidence that anyone at the time noticed this coincidence, but later generations have found it difficult to ignore. Snorri Sturluson, the man who had preserved the old stories of gods and seasons and cosmic cycles, died at the turning of the year. Gizur came with 70 men. This was a substantial force, far more than would have been needed to arrest or kill a single aging chieftain. The size of the party suggests several things. First, that Gizur was uncertain what resistance he might face. Reykholt was a wealthy estate with servants and retainers, and Snorri might have had armed men nearby who would come to his defense. Second, that Gizur wanted witnesses. A killing done by 70 men is a killing that cannot be denied or attributed to accident. It is a statement, a declaration. Third, that the conspiracy was wide enough to include 70 men willing to participate in an act that would define the rest of their lives. They came at night. This was standard practice for Icelandic feuds. Darkness provided cover. It also disoriented the victims, made organized resistance difficult, amplified the psychological impact of the attack. The sources describe the men approaching Reykholt in the darkness, surrounding the estate, cutting off escape routes. They had done this before, most of them. They knew how it worked. The attack began. Men broke into the main buildings. There was some fighting. The sources mention retainers who resisted, though the details are sparse. Snorri was not among the defenders. He was not a fighter. He had never been a fighter. When the violence began, he did what seemed logical. He hid. The cellar at Reykholt was partially underground, a space used for storage, cool and dark. It may have been connected to the famous hot spring pool, though this is uncertain. Snorri made his way there in the chaos of the attack. Perhaps he hoped that the men would take what they wanted and leave. Perhaps he hoped that someone would negotiate on his behalf. Perhaps he was simply terrified, a 62-year-old man in his nightclothes, listening to the sounds of armed men tearing through his home. They found him. Of course they found him. They had come specifically for him, and they would not leave without completing their mission. The sources name the man who discovered Snorri's hiding place as Simon Knútur, Simon Knot. He was one of Gisur's men, and he was the one who stood at the entrance to the cellar and looked down at the old man crouching in the darkness. Egi skal hugva, do not strike. These were Snorri's last words, according to the Icelandic saga, the most detailed source for his death. 3 words in Old Norse, a final plea, or perhaps a final command. The grammatical form is ambiguous. Snorri may have been begging for his life, or may have been trying, one last time, to assert authority he no longer possessed. The men struck anyway. The sources do not describe the killing in detail. They do not tell us how many blows were required, or who exactly delivered them, or what sounds Snorri made as he died. This restraint is characteristic of the saga style. The earlier descriptions of the approach, the hiding, the final words, these are rendered precisely because they matter narratively. The actual moment of death is passed over quickly because it requires no elaboration. The audience knows what happened. The sword descended. The man died. That's enough. What the sources do preserve is the phrase that would echo through Icelandic memory: do not strike. It became famous not because it was successful, Snorri died anyway, but because it crystallized something essential about the man. He was a negotiator, a persuader, a man of words. His final instinct in the face of violence was to use language. He tried to talk his way out. He failed. The men who had come to kill him were beyond words. The killing itself took place in the cellar, in the darkness, underground. There is something appropriate about this that the sources do not explicitly comment on, but that later readers have found difficult to ignore. Snorri had spent his life reconstructing the old stories of the Norse gods, including the stories of the underworld, of hell, of the darkness beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. Now he died in a darkness of his own, cut down by men who had once been his allies and kin. Gizur and his men did not linger. They took what they wanted: wealth, documents, whatever symbols of authority mattered, and they left. The body was left for others to find. The news spread across Iceland in the days that followed. Snorri Sturluson, the lawspeaker, the chieftain, the poet, the author of the Edda and the Heimskringla, was dead. He had been killed by his own son-in-law at the order of the Norwegian king. The killing was not exactly murder by the standards of the time. It had been ordered by a legitimate authority, carried out by men who could claim they were enforcing royal will. But it was not exactly justice either. There had been no trial, no formal accusation, no opportunity for Snorri to defend himself or pay compensation. He had simply been hunted down and killed like an outlaw. The reaction in Iceland was complex. Some chieftains were relieved. Snorri had been a rival, and his death reduced the competition. Some were horrified. The manner of the killing, the night attack, the 70 men, the old man in the cellar, seemed excessive, almost theatrical in its brutality. Some saw it as a sign of what was coming. If the Norwegian king could order the death of a man as prominent as Snorri, no one was safe. The Commonwealth's independence, already eroding, seemed suddenly more fragile. In Norway, Håkon received the news with what the sources describe as displeasure. This may have been genuine. Kings prefer their agents to deliver results without creating scandals. It may have been political performance, Håkon distancing himself from an act he had implicitly authorized. Whatever his private feelings, the king did not punish Gizur for the killing. In fact, Gizur went on to become one of the most powerful chieftains in Iceland in the years that followed, eventually playing a central role in the submission to Norway in 1262-64. The man who killed Snorri Sturluson was rewarded with power and influence. This too was characteristic of the age. The body was buried at Reykholt. There was no grand funeral, no saga-worthy send-off for the great writer. The estate passed to others. The hot spring pool continued to steam in the autumn air. The manuscript books were dispersed, some to other Icelandic collectors, some eventually to the continent, where they would be copied and preserved by scholars who had never heard of the feuds that had consumed their author. What died with Snorri? The question is worth asking, even if it cannot be fully answered. A man died. That is the simplest and most important truth. Whatever else Snorri was, historian, poet, politician, schemer, he was first a human being who breathed and thought and felt. He had loved his children, or at least some of them. He had enjoyed his wealth, his hot spring, his books. He had experienced ambition and disappointment, and in those final moments in the cellar, terror. All of that ended on September 23, 1241. The consciousness that had produced the Edda and the Heimskringla was extinguished. A political faction lost its most prominent member. The Sturlungar had already been weakened by the disaster at Orlugstadir, but Snorri's death removed whatever coherence remained. Without him, the family's influence fragmented further. His descendants would continue to matter in Icelandic politics for some time. Bloodlines do not disappear overnight, but the era of Sturlung dominance was effectively over. A literary tradition lost its greatest practitioner. Snorri had not invented the saga style, but he had perfected certain aspects of it. His combination of historical scope and literary artistry, his ability to synthesize pagan mythology and Christian learning, his ear for dialogue and scene, these qualities were not easily replicated. Others would write sagas after him, some of them very fine, but no one would quite match the ambition of the Heimskringla or the systematic clarity of the prose Edda. And something harder to define was lost. Snorri had been a bridge. He stood between the old Iceland and the new, between the memory of the gods and the reality of Christian rule, between the independence of the Commonwealth and the coming subordination to Norway. He had tried to preserve what he could of the old ways while operating within the new. His works were acts of salvage, attempts to ensure that Odin and Thor and the heroes of the past would not be forgotten. He had largely succeeded, but the man himself, with his contradictions and his ambitions and his failures, could not be preserved in the same way. He died in a cellar in Iceland, and the bridge he had built with words outlasted the bridge he had tried to build with politics. The cellar. It is worth returning to that image because it is the image that the sources chose to preserve. Not the public Snorri, the lawspeaker addressing the Althing, the chieftain feasting at Reykholt, the poet reciting verse before kings, the private Snorri, the frightened Snorri, the old man hiding in the darkness, hoping against hope that the words he had wielded so skillfully throughout his life might save him one more time. They did not. The words did not save him, but they would outlast everything else. In the decades following Snorri's death, Iceland descended into a chaos that made the preceding conflicts look almost orderly. The age of the Sturlungs had merely been prologue. What followed was a sustained collapse, a systematic dismantling of the political structures that had governed the island for over 300 years. The feuds that Snorri had navigated, exploited, and ultimately fallen victim to intensified rather than resolved. More men died, more farms burned, more families were destroyed. Gizur Thorvaldsson prospered. This is perhaps the hardest fact to accept for anyone who wishes history to operate according to moral logic. But the man who had ordered Snorri cut down in his cellar went on to become the most powerful chieftain in Iceland. He accumulated godord after godord. He made alliances with the Norwegian crown. He navigated the same treacherous political waters that had drowned his father-in-law, and he did so with greater success. In 1253, 12 years after the murder, disaster finally found Gizur. His enemies, and by this point he had accumulated many, attacked his estate at Flugumýri while he hosted a wedding feast. They set fire to the buildings. 25 people died in the flames, including Gizur's wife Groa and 3 of his sons. Gizur himself escaped only by hiding in a vat of whey, the liquid concealing him from men who searched the burning farmstead with weapons drawn. There is a symmetry here that the saga writers could not have missed. The man who had cornered Snorri in a cellar was himself reduced to cowering in a container, hoping the darkness would hide him. Whether this represented divine justice or merely the mathematical certainty that in an age of violence, violence eventually finds everyone, the sources do not say. They report the facts and let the reader draw conclusions. Gizur survived. He crawled out of the wayvat when his enemies had gone. He rebuilt. He continued his political career, damaged but not destroyed. And it was Gizur, more than any other single Icelander, who finally negotiated the end of independence. Between 1262 and 1264, through a series of agreements, the chieftains of Iceland swore allegiance to the Norwegian king. The Althing continued to meet, but it now met under foreign sovereignty. The Commonwealth that had begun in 930 was over. Snorri had seen this coming. Whether he had welcomed it or dreaded it, or simply accepted it as inevitable, we cannot know. But he had understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, that the old Iceland could not hold. The Godar had accumulated too much power. The feuds had become too destructive. The wealth disparities had grown too extreme. Something had to give. What gave was independence itself. The submission to Norway brought stability of a sort. The feuds gradually subsided. A new legal code replaced the old. Royal officials began to exercise authority that had once belonged to local chieftains. Iceland became a dependency, an island at the edge of a European kingdom. Its unique political experiment concluded. But the book survived. This is the fact that matters most. From the vantage point of 8 centuries, Snorri died, and his faction collapsed, and the Commonwealth ended, and the feuds burned themselves out. And through it all, the manuscripts he had written and compiled continued to exist. They were copied, they were preserved, they traveled. The Prose Edda was copied at least 4 times before 1300 that we know of. Monks and scribes in Icelandic monasteries recognized its value and reproduced it, ensuring that multiple versions existed in different locations. This was crucial. A single manuscript could be lost to fire, to damp, to neglect, to the simple accidents of time. Multiple manuscripts created redundancy. The knowledge could survive even if individual copies did not. The Heimskringla followed a similar path. It proved popular. The kings it described were figures of immediate interest to Norwegian and Icelandic readers, and the prose was compelling enough to make the historical content accessible. Copies proliferated. By the 14th century, the work existed in multiple recensions, some abbreviated, some expanded, all tracing back to the text Snorri had composed in his study at Reykholt. But here, a complication enters. The original manuscripts, the ones Snorri himself had written or dictated, did not survive. What we possess today are copies of copies, texts that pass through multiple hands before reaching the forms we now read. The earliest complete manuscript of the Prose Edda that survives dates to around 1360 years after Snorri's death. The earliest complete Heimskringla manuscript comes from somewhat later. This means we are reading Snorri through a filter. Scribes made errors, scribes made corrections. Scribes occasionally interpolated their own material, or omitted passages they found confusing, or modernized language that seemed archaic. The texts we attribute to Snorri are reconstructions, scholarly assemblages based on comparing multiple manuscripts and making educated guesses about what the original versions must have contained. This is the condition of all medieval literature. We never read the author directly. We read what survived, which is always less than what was written, shaped by the accidents and intentions of everyone who touched the text between its composition and our reading. What survived of Snorri was still extraordinary. The Prose Edda reached continental Europe by the 17th century. Danish and Swedish scholars, caught up in the antiquarian enthusiasm of the age, recognized its significance. Here was a systematic account of Norse mythology written by someone who had still had access to the living tradition. Here were the names and stories of gods that had been worshipped across Scandinavia before Christianity arrived. Here was a window into a vanished world. The first printed edition appeared in 1665 in Denmark. Suddenly, the Edda was no longer a manuscript accessible to a handful of scholars. It was a book that could be purchased, read, and discussed across Europe. The impact was gradual but profound. The myths Snorri had preserved began to enter European consciousness. Odin and Thor and Freya and Loki became available as cultural resources, figures that artists and writers and composers could draw upon. The Heimskringla followed a similar trajectory. It was printed in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was translated into Danish, Swedish, Latin, and eventually English. The kings Snorri had chronicled, Harald Fairhair, Olaf Tryggvason, Saint Olaf, Harald Hardrada, became figures of European history rather than merely Scandinavian memory. And then, in the 19th century, something remarkable happened. Europe discovered the Vikings. This was not a discovery in the literal sense. Educated people had always known that Norse raiders had once troubled the coasts of England and France. But it was a discovery in the imaginative sense. Romanticism, nationalism, and the growing scholarly interest in medieval literature combined to produce an explosion of interest in the Norse past. Suddenly, Odin and Thor were everywhere. Suddenly, the sagas were being translated into every major European language. Suddenly, Viking imagery was appearing in paintings, operas, and monuments. Richard Wagner drew on the Norse myths for his Ring cycle, which premiered between 1869 and 1876. The Valkyries that ride through his operas, the cursed ring that drives the plot, the twilight of the gods that concludes the cycle, all of this traces back ultimately to the texts Snorri had compiled. Wagner did not read Old Norse. He worked from German translations and retellings, but the chain of transmission runs clear. From the mouths of poets in the 10th and 11th centuries to Snorri's pen in the 13th, to the manuscripts that preserved his work, to the printed editions that made it available, to the scholarly apparatus that translated and explained it, to the operatic imagination that transformed it into music. This is what Snorri made possible. Not the Ring cycle specifically, he could not have imagined that, but the survival of the raw material from which such works could be built. Consider what we would not know without him. We would not know that Odin hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the knowledge of the runes. We would not know that Thor's hammer was forged by dwarves, that its handle was too short because Loki interfered with its making. We would not know that Fenrir the wolf was bound by a chain made from the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. We would not know that the world would end at Ragnarok, when the Midgard serpent rises from the sea and the sky splits open and the fire giant Surtur marches from the south with a burning sword. We might know the names. Odin and Thor appear in place names and weekday names and scattered references throughout medieval literature. But the stories, the rich, strange, morally complex narratives that give the names meaning, those would be gone. We would not know the kings. The lives Snorri chronicled in the Heimskringla, the unification of Norway, the conversion to Christianity, the political struggles that shaped Scandinavian history, would be far more obscure without his work. Other sources exist, but none with his scope, his detail, his narrative power. Generations of historians have relied on the Heimskringla as a foundation, even when they argue with its interpretations or question its reliability. It is the unavoidable text, the starting point for any serious engagement with Viking Age Scandinavia. We would not know certain aspects of how the Norse understood poetry itself. The Skaldskaparmal, the second part of the Prose Edda, is a technical treatise on skaldic verse, explaining the elaborate metaphorical system that the skalds used. Without it, much of the poetry that survives would be incomprehensible. The kennings, those compressed metaphors that call the sea whale road and gold Sif's hair and battle the meeting of shields, require a key. Snorri provided the key. He explained which kennings referred to what, which gods were associated with which objects, which stories gave rise to which metaphors. He made the poetry legible. This is preservation of a particular kind, not merely saving texts, but saving the ability to understand texts. Snorri knew that the poetic tradition was dying, that the knowledge necessary to interpret it was fading from memory. He wrote down what he knew before it was too late. The question of his motivations continues to haunt scholars. Why did he do it? What drove a busy chieftain, a man consumed by political scheming and legal maneuvering and feuds, to sit down and systematically compile the mythology and poetics of his ancestors? One answer is pragmatic. Snorri was a poet himself, a practitioner of the skaldic art, and he may have compiled the Edda partly as a teaching tool, a handbook for young poets who wished to master the traditional forms. The work would have had immediate practical value in his circle. Another answer is political. Snorri had spent time at the Norwegian court. He knew that Norwegian kings valued skalds who could compose in the old style. By compiling and explaining that style, he may have been positioning himself and his students and his country as indispensable cultural resources for the crown. Another answer is antiquarian. Snorri lived in an age when the old was visibly giving way to the new. The gods his great-grandfather might have half believed in were now merely stories. The political system that had governed Iceland for centuries was obviously failing. Perhaps he simply wanted to preserve what he could of a world that was passing away. And another answer is aesthetic. Snorri was a writer. He cared about language, about story, about the shape of a well-constructed sentence. The myths he preserved were beautiful, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps he wrote them down because they deserved to be written down. Most likely, all of these motivations operated simultaneously. Human beings rarely act from single causes. Snorri may have been a pragmatist and a schemer and an antiquarian and an artist all at once, each motivation reinforcing the others. What matters is that he did it. Whatever his reasons, he wrote. The years after his death saw his work dispersed across Iceland. The manuscripts traveled from estate to estate, monastery to monastery. Some were lost, others survived through chance or care. The island remained literate, remained devoted to its manuscript culture, even as its political independence collapsed. In 1380, Iceland passed from Norwegian to Danish rule, following a dynastic union. The manuscripts that preserved Snorri's work were now part of a Danish realm, their fate tied to the fortunes of a distant crown. In the 16th century, the Reformation swept through Scandinavia. Monasteries were dissolved, properties were seized. Many manuscripts were lost in the upheaval, their parchment repurposed or destroyed or simply neglected. But some Icelandic manuscripts survived, protected by collectors who recognized their value or simply lucky enough to avoid destruction. In the 17th century, systematic collection began. The Danish antiquarian Arne Magnusson spent years traveling through Iceland, gathering manuscripts, buying them, borrowing them, occasionally stealing them. He amassed the greatest collection of Icelandic literature ever assembled, eventually numbering thousands of items. In 1728, when fire swept through Copenhagen, Arne lost about a third of his collection. He never recovered from the blow, dying 3 years later, but the rest survived. The Arne Magnusson Institute, named for the man who had devoted his life to preservation, now holds the core of what remains of medieval Icelandic literature. The manuscripts sit in climate-controlled storage in Reykjavik, the words Snorri wrote 8 centuries ago preserved through paper and ink, and the efforts of generations of scholars who understood that these texts were irreplaceable. Snorri's hot spring still exists. You can visit Reykholt today, walk the grounds, see the pool where the water still rises warm from the earth. A tunnel, though fragmentary, runs from the pool toward where the farmhouse once stood. Scholars debate whether it dates to Snorri's time. The church is gone, replaced by later structures. The landscape has changed, but the spring remains. There's a statue now near the pool. It depicts Snorri seated, looking out across the valley, a book in his hand. The statue was erected in 1947, a gift from Norway, which seems appropriate given the tangled relationship between Snorri and the Norwegian crown. The man who tried and failed to deliver Iceland to King Haakon is now commemorated by a gift from the kingdom he served and betrayed. The inscription calls him the most famous Icelander of the Middle Ages. This is probably accurate. His fame has outlasted his politics, outlasted his feuds, outlasted the Commonwealth whose end he failed to prevent. He is remembered for the books, and the books have shaped things he could never have imagined. When J.R.R. Tolkien created Middle-earth, he drew deeply on the Norse materials that Snorri had preserved. The dwarves in The Hobbit take their names from a list in the prose. Edda, Thorin, Dwalin, Balin, Bifur, Bofur, and the rest are all there in a catalogue of dwarf names that Snorri included in his work. The ring that corrupts, the dragon that hoards gold, the sense of a world moving from a heroic past toward a diminished future, all of these elements have roots in the Norse tradition that Snorri transmitted. When Marvel Comics created Thor in 1962, they turned to the same source material. The blonde god with the hammer, his trickster brother Loki, the rainbow bridge to Asgard. These images come from the Edda, filtered through centuries of adaptation but traceable back to the manuscripts that began with Snorri. The influence is so pervasive that it has become invisible. Most people who encounter Norse mythology today do not know Snorri's name. They do not think about the 13th century chieftain who systematized and preserved these stories. They simply absorb the gods and the monsters and the apocalyptic vision of Ragnarok as part of the shared cultural furniture of the modern world, without knowing where that furniture came from. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of Snorri's legacy. He is everywhere and nowhere. His work permeates modern fantasy, modern popular culture, modern conceptions of the medieval past, and yet he himself remains obscure, a specialist's concern, a figure known mainly to scholars and enthusiasts. The man was ambitious. The man wanted to be remembered. The man schemed and plotted and maneuvered to secure his place in history, to accumulate the wealth and power that would ensure his name endured, and his name endures. But not for the reasons he expected. He is remembered not as the great chieftain who united the Icelandic factions, not as the lawspeaker who shaped the law, not as the ally of kings who brokered Iceland's union with Norway. All of those ambitions failed. The political Snorri, the scheming Snorri, the Snorri who wanted worldly power, that man is remembered mainly as a cautionary tale, a figure whose overreach brought him to a cellar and a sword. He is remembered for what he wrote. This is the deep irony that runs through his entire story. The books were never the main thing for Snorri. They were side projects, intellectual hobbies, things he did when he was not engaged in the serious business of acquiring chieftaincies and navigating feuds. The prose Edda was a handbook. The Heimskringla was flattery dressed as history. These were tools, means to ends, not ends in themselves, and these tools outlived everything else. The ends Snorri pursued, the political victories, the accumulated wealth, the family dynasty, all of that crumbled within decades of his death. But the means endured. The books persisted. The words he had written as instruments of ambition became monuments that stood long after the ambition had been forgotten. There is a lesson here, perhaps, about what lasts. Power is temporary. Wealth disperses. Alliances dissolve. The structures we build with political cunning and military force are inherently unstable, dependent on constant maintenance, vulnerable to the shifts of fortune that medieval Icelanders understood so well. But works of the mind, books, poems, the careful arrangement of words on parchment, these have a different relationship with time. They can be copied. They can be preserved. They can survive the deaths of their creators and the collapse of the societies that produced them. Snorri understood this in a way. He was an antiquarian. He knew that the past was fragile, that it required active effort to preserve. He wrote the Edda partly because he saw that the poetic tradition was dying, that the knowledge of the old myths was fading. He acted to save what could be saved, but he did not understand how fully this principle would apply to his own life. He did not know that his political career would become a footnote to his literary achievement, that the feuds he thought so important would interest future generations only as context for the books. He died thinking he had failed. He died in a cellar, cornered, betrayed, with the political structures he had spent his life building collapsing around him. He did not die knowing that the works he had created almost incidentally would become the foundation for an entire field of study, that scholars centuries later would devote their careers to the texts he had compiled, that his name would be attached to university departments and academic conferences and a seemingly inexhaustible stream of dissertations. He did not die knowing about Wagner, about Tolkien, about the Marvel movies, about the video games and the fantasy novels and the heavy metal albums that would draw on the mythology he preserved. He died in 1241, and the world that would be shaped by his work was unimaginably distant. The night was cold, the autumn darkness of an Icelandic September. The cellar was dark. The armed men descended. The words that had served him so well throughout his life, words that had secured him power, flattered kings, preserved the memories of gods, those words in the end were not enough. Egi skal hugva, do not strike. They struck, and then silence, the body cooling on the cellar floor, the steam rising from the hot spring outside, the manuscripts sitting in their chests, pages covered in the angular strokes of Icelandic script containing stories of gods who would die at the world's end, and kings who had ruled centuries before, and metaphors for swords and ships and the sea that stretched endlessly westward. The men who killed him went away. They washed their weapons. They returned to their own farms, their own feuds, their own scheming. They did not know they had just killed the most important Icelander of his age. They thought they had killed a political threat, an inconvenient old man whose ambitions had become problematic. The manuscripts did not know their author was dead. Parchment does not mourn. Ink does not notice the cessation of the hand that once held the pen. The words sat on the pages, unchanged, indifferent, waiting for other eyes to read them, other hands to copy them, other minds to receive what they contained. 800 years. The spring at Reykholt has been steaming for longer than that. The hot water has been rising from the volcanic depths since before humans reached Iceland, since before the mountains were named, since before language itself existed to describe the vapor and the pool and the warmth. The spring does not remember Snorri. It does not remember anyone. It simply continues, heat from the Earth's core reaching the surface, the same process that was operating when he lowered himself into the water, and the same process that operates now when tourists arrive to see where the great writer once bathed. The pool has been maintained. A modern walkway leads to it. Signs explain its historical significance. The water is still warm enough to soak in, still connected by some ancient passageway to that subterranean world where Snorri's imagination placed dwarves in their underground halls and hell in her realm of the dead. He walked here. He thought here. He composed sentences in his head while the steam rose around him, looking out at the valley and the mountains and the sky that changed from hour to hour, thinking about Odin hanging on the tree, about Harald Fairhair at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, about the kennings that made the sea a whale road and battle a storm of swords. He was trying to preserve a world. He succeeded. The world he lived in is gone. The Commonwealth is gone. The Godar are gone. The feuds are finished. The men who killed him are dust. The men they feuded with are dust. The political structures they all fought over have been replaced 3 or 4 times over by other structures that themselves will eventually be replaced. Nothing that Snorri sought through his scheming still exists. But on a shelf in Reykjavik and in libraries around the world and in translations into languages Snorri never knew existed, the books remain. The gods remain. Thor still raises his hammer. Odin still stares from his single eye. The serpent still waits at the world's edge for the final battle. And a man who died in a cellar in Iceland 8 centuries ago continues to speak. The words did not save him, but the words survived.